a Russian army which hails the destruction of Grozny as victory.
Weeks of continued bombing and shelling by the Russians have reduced much of this city to rubble. This is a lesson the Chechens won't easily forget. This is the new front line in the Chechen War. Now the Russian army has taken Grozny, the fighting has again moved to the countryside.
The car that exploded was parked in the very centre of Grozny, alongside the headquarters of the Russian-backed administration. The decision to go in was wrong from the start. We needed a political way out, says this recruit.
We witnessed the heart-rending spectacle of the hostages waving white flags from the windows and screaming to the soldiers to stop firing. The battle has been going on for 2 hours now. It's still taking place at a terrifying pace. An operation that was supposed to save lives now seems destined to end in tragic bloodshed.
The Russian army says the operation to clear all illegal armed formations from the streets of the Chechen capital is now over. Today, for the first time, we witnessed the full extent of the devastation that was part of that operation. Weeks of continued bombing and shelling by the Russians have reduced much of this city to rubble. This is a lesson the Chechens won't easily forget. A few weeks ago, Grozny was home to 400,000 people, Russians and Chechens alike. Now it's a city of scavengers, a tiny population scratching a living out of the ruins, each with their own story to tell.
The
soldiers came and machine-gunned their way through our front door, says this woman. They shot our furniture to pieces, took anything they wanted and left. If they wanted to rob you, says another, they ordered you onto your knees in the street, stripped you to the waist and left you there for hours. A few refugees are returning, trying to patch together what little remains after the Russian invasion. This family were amazed to find their house still standing. They count themselves lucky. In the northern suburbs, locals are still burying the dead. This service was for a Russian soldier killed just a few yards from here in the last days of fighting for the city. Ironically, he's buried alongside Orthodox Russians he attacked. There are a few Chechens in this part of Grozny. Spring has come early to the Caucasus, and the warmer weather brings the added danger of disease. Rotting corpses still litter the streets. Aid agencies are already warning of a possible epidemic. Russian soldiers now control all the streets in Grozny. They're happy to cruise around the city now they've crushed the last pockets of resistance. When the army's ready, it'll allow a new government in waiting into the capital. The opposition council was due to arrive in Grozny today. It's been waiting for the Russian army to escort its leaders into the city and allow them to set up a new administration. But there's little left here to administer, and few Chechens are likely to support a government held up by an army that's razed much of this city to the ground. At the headquarters of the Provisional Council in Znamenskoye, an hour's drive to the north of Grozny, Moscow's chosen successor for the Chechen leadership already regards himself as the legitimate successor to the ousted president Eduard Shevardnadze.
The Provisional Council was the opposition. Now it's the legitimate power in Chechnya. Eduard Shevardnadze is in the opposition, and anyone who says we've seized power, I can tell them that we will hold free and fair elections when we are ready.
This evening there is an uneasy calm over the Chechen capital. There is talk of a ceasefire brokered to the southwest of the city between the Russian army and Chechen fighters. But this afternoon there was still sporadic gunfire around Grozny, and Russian troops say they'll shoot at anything that moves after nightfall. Lawrence MacDonald, Channel 4 News, Grozny. In the village of Samashki, some 30 miles west of Grozny, a family prepares to bury the latest victim of the ceasefire in Chechnya. A father of 4, this man was working overnight at the mill when he was hit by a piece of shrapnel. Just hours before, the Russians had agreed not to use heavy weapons. This is the new front line in the Chechen War. Now the Russian army has taken Grozny, the fighting has again moved to the countryside. But at negotiations in the neighbouring village of Slipsovsk, the Chechen fighters are in no mood to compromise. They'll use the ceasefire to collect their dead, but say they're ready to fight on. The rebel president Eduard Shevardnadze has gone into hiding, but outside the village we met a Russian member of parliament who'd just come back from secret talks with the Chechen leader. He told us General Dudayev is still confident of beating the Russians.
He thinks that they will be able to take Grozny back and to make the Russian troops withdraw. And the instructions he gave to his commander-in-chief for the negotiations with the Russian army are the conditions for the withdrawal of Russian troops from Grozny.
The Chechen War is by no means going all the Russian army's way. 20-year-old Vladimir Gusakov is a fairly typical Russian prisoner of war. He gave himself up to the Chechens 10 days ago and doesn't want to be handed back. His captors stage-managed an interrogation for our cameras. He told us many of his officers were more interested in looting than beating the Chechen fighters into submission.
Офицеры периодически солдатами ходили по домам, собирали видеоаппаратуру, оргтехнику, бытовую аппаратуру. Командир батальона тоже там занимался, его ингуши уже предупреждали, если ты еще раз будешь заниматься мародерством, то мы тебя никак не будем. Также он продолжал, нашли трофейный Урал, и вот на трофейном Урале это все доставлялось в Владикавказ.
Another sign of the breakdown in Russian discipline is the increasing number of reports of indiscriminate acts of aggression against ordinary Chechens. This man says Russian soldiers waved him through a checkpoint. As he walked on, they shot him from behind.
Так разбитый. Я ползти начал. Где-то 20 трупов, да не видит, что я живой ползу. Минами начали забрасывать. 6 мин разорвалось. Метры буквально от меня.
Eduard Dudayev always said he'd carry on the war from the south of Grozny. But not all Chechen fighters here are pro-Dudayev. These men support the Chechen opposition. Dudayev has reduced this country to rubble and turned the people into cattle, says this man. In an election, this man says he'd vote for the Party of Peace, the party led by another famous Chechen rebel, Ruslan Khasbulatov. In his apartment in Moscow, the former speaker of the Russian parliament showed me how many Chechens turned out to support him at a rally outside Grozny just before the war. He warns the fighting could spread.
Надо прекратить военные. На мой взгляд, нельзя переносить эти военные действия на другие тровы, на другие города. Грозно уже разрушен, разгромлен. Иначе станут действительно все и женщины, и дети. Ведь Кавказ может, когда Великая Кавказская война может.
In his address today to the Russian parliament, President Yeltsin admitted for the first time that the Russian army had badly mishandled the Chechen invasion. He'd like to say the military operation is now over, but the present ceasefire could at best be described as fragile, and the longer the fighting drags on, the weaker his position. Lawrence MacDonald, Channel 4 News, Chechnya.
The events and the tragedy in Chechnya takes its root in its origin in Abkhazia. But I'm certain that in the nearest future even this conflict will come to an end. And in that territory the jurisdiction of Russia shall be re-established. There cannot be any different solution.
But the Chechnyan crisis was allowed to continue for a long time before Mr. Yeltsin moved. Do you think he let it? Do you think he let it stand for too long?
Я встречался с президентом Ельциным сейчас.
I've just met President Yeltsin a few days ago in Almaty.
Он мне говорил,
He did mention to me
что это
that
серьезная ошибка.
this was a grave mistake on the part of the leadership of Russia, that in its own time no action has been taken in order not to allow the creation of such enormous army, which is perfectly well armed in one of the regions of Russia. It is true, that was an error, a mistake. It had to be rectified sooner or later. Obviously, it is fearsome that there have been so many victims and frightful, but all that could be done before and differently. But for the time being, the Russian leadership, now it simply had no other way out, no other solution.
Could anybody outside Russia have done anything to help? I mean, should we have, or the Americans or NATO have been prepared to do anything?
I think that Russia will be able to sort it out by itself. Well, it's something else, observers or people who would be interested in all those events. But the principal solutions must be taken by the leaders of Russia, and by those leaders of Chechnya.
Let me ask you a last question, and it's a simple one. Which is harder, to have served under Gorbachev as his foreign minister amid the disintegration of the Soviet Union, or to have been president of one of the states that emerged from that union and then became racked by civil war?
It is more difficult to be at the head of a small state. Simply because there are more problems than the large Soviet Union had at the time, and the fewer reserves and resources. But now it is easier. It's become easier. The situation is getting stabilized.
For the thousands of communists marching through the centre of Moscow this afternoon, the most welcome reform would be Mr. Yeltsin's resignation. They accuse the Russian leader of bringing this country to its knees, of sapping the lifeblood of its army. At the Red Army Theatre in Moscow, new conscripts are enjoying a day out. They're growing up in a very different world to their heroic predecessors. Today's play reflects everyday themes: drunkenness, official corruption, criticisms that go to the very top of Russian society. Hardly surprising then that these young soldiers should blame the government and not their commanders for the war in Chechnya. The decision to go in was wrong from the start. We needed a political way out, says this recruit. For many Russians, today is a time to remember this country's glorious past. A past when every citizen could take pride in the Soviet Union's superpower status. Those days are long gone. Army Day just isn't the same anymore. It marks the founding of the Red Army, an army that, under Stalin, once deported the whole of the Chechen nation in a matter of hours. Today's Russian army, after more than 2 months of fighting, still hasn't managed to crush Chechnya's bid for independence. It's hardly the time to celebrate this country's military prowess. In the past, the armed forces enjoyed pride of place in Soviet society. The Kremlin was always keen to show off its weaponry. Even if the technology wasn't state-of-the-art, it was the sheer size of the Soviet arsenal that made this country a superpower. More than 40% of the national budget was spent on the armed forces. Under communist rule, the Politburo was always prepared to finance the military. It didn't need to be asked. Nowadays, the army has to argue its case, and it just doesn't know how.
I do not believe that the military have learned the new way of doing business with Parliament or with the executive. And this is part of the problem, because the military feel frustrated that their voice is not heard. And when it is heard, it is not heeded. And that brings the army to the state of desperation.
The Chechen War has been the Russian Federation Army's first real test on the battlefield since the breakup of the Soviet Union. It failed badly. In the main push on the Chechen capital on New Year's Eve, Dozens of tanks and armoured personnel carriers were crippled and then destroyed. Hundreds of young Russian soldiers were burnt alive. But the army's problem isn't just one of poor technology and underfunding. It's suffering a crisis of manpower. These conscripts were the ones who didn't get away. In the last year alone, tens of thousands of young men have dodged the draft for one reason or another. At the main recruiting station in St. Petersburg, the commander in charge of the call-up says the situation is critical.
More than 50% of new conscripts are evading the call-up. 40% have to be tracked down. Only relatively few are taken to court. In this region alone, we're looking for 700 men. And after the fighting in Chechnya, there has been a strong campaign against the war.
Today, many new recruits are taken on contract, part of Russia's new professional army. But the army can only afford minimum wages, and those who do join up are by no means those best suited to the job.
Very often the soldiers who come under the contract system to the armed forces are not willing to fight. They're not willing to be deployed to the outlying posts, and that clearly does not help the morale of the armed forces. Very often this corrupts the morale of the armed forces.
Tonight, Moscow is celebrating National Army Day as it always has. Boris Yeltsin has promised the Russian armed forces a glorious future as well as a glorious past. But the army feels badly let down by its political leaders, and unless they act soon, it might well decide to take matters into its own hands. Lawrence McDonnell, Channel 4 News, Moscow.
Today, as the tugboats of Genoa celebrated his presence here for this Perestroika conference, I spoke with Gorbachev in upbeat form. We started with history. When he came in 10 years ago tonight, had he expected to last 10, 20 years?
No, but it never really entered my mind at all. But if you want to know, really all I was thinking was, if I was going to preserve power, if my thoughts really had turned on that subject, then most likely I would have had to confine myself not to real reforms at all, but to mere cosmetic adjustments and touch-ups. And for me, that would have been completely unacceptable. And I never thought about that at all. All I thought about was how to carry out my plans.
But you knew even then that if there was not change, then the Soviet Union would get into terrible trouble.
The lid on the cauldron of the Soviet Union was simply hardly holding any longer. Steam was starting to escape and the whole thing was about to blow. So it's not just that the reforms were due, they were overdue. And suggestions that somebody gave instructions for the reforms to be initiated, that's simply not serious. Attempts to reform the country were already overdue back in the time of Stalin.
But once you started on Perestroika, there was a time when you were very popular. Do you regret now that you didn't risk going for a democratic mandate?
But you know, that really wasn't the problem. I felt that my position was solid. My support was colossal. And I didn't need any additional legal actions of some sort to buttress my situation.
You were introducing democracy to a people who had never known it. You felt you were still very strong because of the power, the undemocratic power that you had. Didn't you feel you should have gone for election yourself?
Well, there's no doubt that back in 1990, towards the end of the year, public opinion polls, nationwide surveys, showed that there really wasn't any rival to Gorbachev. Gorbachev's rating was the very highest. And in second place behind him was Yeltsin, who in 1990 was running at 6 or 7%, whereas Gorbachev was scoring 70, 80%. So perhaps I was very self-confident. Perhaps I was, but it's all perhaps.
Let's look at the present day. Are you very frightened for Russia?
Well, to say that I'm frightened would be difficult after everything I've been through. I don't know what could frighten Gorbachev any longer, but I do feel alarm about the future of Russia.
Mr. Yavlinsky, for example, has said it's time Mr. Yeltsin went, that he is not fit any longer to be the president of Russia. What's your feeling? Is Mr. Yeltsin still fit to govern Russia?
Yeltsin's finished. Yeltsin is finished. It's true, I don't really know, but looking back from today, I'm not sure what Yeltsin was, whether he was more destructive than creative. It obviously didn't work out, and I noticed that long ago, back in Moscow.
Now, we have two sets of elections. There are the parliamentary elections in December, and then next year there are the presidential elections. Will you be a candidate?
I haven't yet taken a decision. I don't rule out the possibility that it may be a positive decision. But I'm still weighing up the situation. You see before you a man who, after all, knows a fair bit about politics, and I'm not interested in engaging in adventures. If I do feel that my fellow countrymen need me, and if I feel inclined, I'll go for it.
That sounds more yes than no, more da than niet.
Let's wait and see when they set the date for the elections. I'll give you an exclusive interview, and then you'll know what my decision was.
Fine, we'll certainly take you up on that, Mikhail Gorbachev. But more seriously, which is the greater threat to Russia today, the mafia or the extreme nationalists?
It's both. I mean the adventure in Chechnya and the rise of mafia-like structures, which are the outcome of the present regime. That has to be changed.
The Yeltsin regime?
Yes, of course. Of course.
Crime,
we had crime before, we had the shadow economy before, but not on this scale, not on this dangerous scale. All of that's the outcome of the last few years.
There are many who say, look, the choice isn't any longer about Mikhail Gorbachev. The choice, in a way, is either to go for kind of Brezhnev or Stalin, the old order, or something completely new. Can you really offer something that is still relevant?
I don't think you have any reason to suppose, because you and we and Russia, we all know who Gorbachev is. We know his nature, we know his views, and at my age you don't change your views. I'm a convinced partisan of democracy. I want to see Russia reborn in the framework of democratic transformations. I want to see my country stable and democratic, self-confident, and peace-loving. That's my credo, and all the rest of his details of politics.
The problem is Gorbimania is in the West still. You're still very admired in the West for what you did. But the same feeling is still not really there in Russia.
I feel fine when I'm in Russia. I travel around, I make contact with people. People want to get to know me and hear my views. And it's not only my supporters who come along. There are people who don't accept my views, but nevertheless, they ask their questions, they want to know my arguments. But that's perfectly normal. That is the democratic process. And I think you could say that there's a great deal of change going on in Russia now, including attitudes to Gorbachev.
Mikhail Gorbachev, thank you very much indeed, and I'm going to keep you to the exclusive interview you've promised me when you announce the presidency.
Yes, fine.
Thank you very much.
Fine.
Thank you.
Mikhail Gorbachev talking to me earlier here in Genoa, and it would certainly be surprising if he were to make such a comeback. Yet 10 years on from that fateful night that projected him into the leadership of the Soviet Union, only to preside over its death, that is exactly what he's aiming for.
A Russian army which hails the destruction of Grozny as victory. The ruins of General Dadaev's presidential palace standing as a grotesque monument of conquest. And the lost soul of a population left with nothing. Into all of this helplessness, a small medical team from the British Merlin organization have joined a desperately ill-resourced aid effort.
first time you come into Grozny, it's bad and it's really quite unbelievable what you see. But it's only when you've been in several days and you realise that this nightmare is a continuous nightmare for the people that live here, that they're not going to wake up from this.
Dr. Rob Bennett is one of the few trying to assess the health needs of Grozny's survivors in their shattered homes. With malnourishment, a lack of drugs for chronic illness, and the risk of disease, the task is colossal. And every day brings new despair for his team. This used to be the garden of an old people's home. It's now a cemetery. Since the war came to Grozny, Malika Teshinskaya has buried more than 30 of the old folk in shallow graves. She tells the team's medical coordinator, Dr. Michael Schubert, how all the staff left and she's the only one caring for 32 old folk. Only a few are able to leave their beds. They live in appalling conditions. There's no sanitation, no medical care, and the only food is flour and water noodles. She says the people are simply waiting to die.
The situation is very serious, and I'm very shocked from what I saw here. I've been for more than 4 weeks here in Grozny now in order to do a medical assessment for our organization. And I've never seen that before, and we certainly have to do something immediately.
The Merlin Group have managed to set up a clinic to assist the few remaining doctors in Grozny. They estimate that 15,000 of the city's estimated 100,000 remaining population need medical attention. 10 out of Grozny's 14 hospitals were destroyed. There simply is no health system here, and with the onset of summer, thousands of bodies lying in shallow graves and an unknown number buried in the rubble, the risk of disease is high. Food is scarce, there is free distribution, but demand outstrips supplies.
It's all down to each individual's strength as to whether or not they get a loaf of bread. Every facet of ordinary life in Grozny has been destroyed. All that remains is a human will to survive.
And with no running water, the people often have to walk miles to aid points for their supplies. The destitution of the people is being catalogued by the Merlin Group. Here, one of their nurses meets a woman who's just returned to what remains of her home.
It was a beautiful city, and now it's terrible. It seems unreal.
The depression hanging over the people of Grozny will not go away. They see no future, and they're given no assurances as Russia's war machine rolls on to other parts of Chechnya. Andrew Simmons, News at 10 in Grozny.
Near the hospital in Budyonnovsk, Russian soldiers run across the road to avoid Chechen sniper fire. The Russians have the hospital surrounded, but they're still jumpy. Troops went to action stations against a possible attack when they heard a vehicle was coming out. But in fact, a van that came out later contained the first small sign of hope in this desperate hostage crisis. A 3-year-old boy released by the Chechens because he is gravely ill with double pneumonia. But for about 1,000 other hostages, there is no such sign of mercy. In the long silences between the bursts of sniper fire, the Chechens are sitting tight with their hostages, just about 200 yards behind me over there. The Russian government has offered them an aircraft to take them to any country in the world that is willing to accept them. But so far there is no sign whatsoever that the Chechens will agree. The Chechens have allowed journalists to see some of their captives as part of a chaotic press visit to the hospital, which was punctuated by gunfire around the building. Journalists saw hostages under guard in a corridor, some of them openly appealing for help. The Chechen fighters, who include women, are still threatening to kill the hostages if the Russian government does not halt its campaign in Chechnya. Their commander is the fanatical and much-feared guerrilla fighter Shamil Basayev. There has already been more than enough death and grief. At a mass burial of dozens of people who died in the first stage of the attack, helicopter gunships protected the mourners. For these Russians, the terrible war in Chechnya has come home in the most tragic way, and the worst is perhaps still to come. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Budyonnovsk. At 5 o'clock this morning, Moscow time, Russian troops began what was supposed to be an operation to free more than 1,000 hostages in the Budyonnovsk hospital. Some government ministers had spoken of restraint, concern for the hostages' lives. But today, the troops advanced in a blaze of firepower. The battle has been going on for 2 hours now. It's still taking place at a terrifying pace. The Russians are right in the heart of the hospital complex. They're using heavy machine guns mounted on armored vehicles, and we really don't know what the fate of the hundreds, perhaps even thousands of hostages now is. From a building opposite the hospital, we witnessed the heart-rending spectacle of the hostages waving white flags from the windows and screaming to the soldiers to stop firing. But the shooting went on. More troops were brought up, members of the elite Alpha Group Commando Force. But the operation quickly showed signs of confusion, with the Russian troops suffering losses and the hospital starting to burn. In a lull, the Chechens released about 100 of the hostages, including terrified mothers carrying their babies from the maternity unit where they had been held. Tonight, the Chechens released more hostages, saying they would free the rest if the Russian army halted its attacks in Chechnya. But there is very little hope of any kind of deal. And an operation that was supposed to save lives now seems destined to end in tragic bloodshed. Julian Mannion, ITN, Budyonnovsk. The day began with gunfire. Russian bullets slammed into the battered walls of the hospital, but this time there was no full-scale attack. Instead, a little later, a team of Russian negotiators walked out into no man's land and entered the burnt-out hospital for talks with the Chechens. There is now a small glimmer of hope for the surviving hostages, but it remains very difficult to see how there can be a peaceful solution with the hatred that exists between Russians and Chechens and the blood that was spilt yesterday. Then the first stage of the deal was carried out, the release of a large number of women and children as a sign of good faith by the Chechens. For some, there was overwhelming joy. A mother burst into tears on getting back her son. The Russians have apparently agreed to let the Chechen fighters leave with some of the hostages to guarantee their safety. But the question is whether their departure will turn into a bloodbath. Julian Mannion, ITN, Budyonnovsk. It was lunchtime when hooded Chechen fighters, some of them wounded, began to board the first of 6 buses at the door of the battered hospital. They took with them about 60 of the hostages who had volunteered to go with the gunmen in order to win freedom for the rest. There were also 5 Russian MPs and about a dozen Russian journalists who had decided that they would bear witness to this final stage of the hostage drama at the risk of their own lives. Inside each of the buses, about 20 Chechen gunmen and the small number of hostages on whom their lives now depend. This is how Shamil Basayev and his men hope to live to fight again another day after committing this terrorist act in a small town in Russia. As the buses passed, a glimpse of the hostages still in Chechen hands set off an explosion of grief and rage among people still waiting for news of their relatives inside the hospital. Even the moment when the bulk of the hostages were freed produced very mixed emotions. Inside the hospital, medical staff spoke of their horror at being fired on by Russian troops during Saturday's abortive attempt to storm the hospital. A doctor described how they screamed, "Don't shoot, don't shoot," but the soldiers didn't seem to hear. On one of the first buses to take hostages back to their homes, women wept at the memory of what they had just lived through. But again, the Russian government's conduct came under fierce attack. One woman called on Boris Yeltsin to withdraw Russian troops from Chechnya. Now, she said, she knows what that war is like. At an army cordon, embarrassed soldiers were confronted by this anger. "How could you possibly fire on your own people?" one man shouted. About 100 hostages are now known to have died as a result of Russian army fire. There has been relief and joy for scores of families reunited, but for the people of this town in southern Russia, these have been bitter days that will scar them forever. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Budyonnovsk. Russia's worst ever hostage crisis is not yet over. The buses carrying 60 hostages and their Chechen captors traveled all night. The Chechen commander Shamil Basayev rejected a route proposed by the Russians and took the convoy round Chechnya through neighbouring Dagestan. As Russian army flares lit the landscape, the Russian government's guarantee of safe passage became less and less dependable. It now seems to mean safe passage through Russia, but not inside Chechnya itself. Russian MPs who volunteered to travel with the convoy used a satellite telephone to speak to their Prime Minister Viktor Chernomyrdin, but got no clear answers. Today the convoy halted in the Dagestani town of Khasavyurt, which has a large Chechen population. Thousands of them turned out to see Shamil Basayev, who in their eyes is a hero. Here Basayev demanded a written Russian guarantee that his men would not be attacked when they crossed the Chechen border. He didn't get it, and after an 8-hour wait the convoy moved on towards Chechnya. Tonight the question all Russia is asking is, will the army catch Shamil Basayev? If they fail, it will be a serious defeat, for Basayev has proved that in spite of Russia's overwhelming military superiority, the Chechen rebels can strike at a Russian town and destroy its heart. Julian Mannion, News at 10, Budyonnovsk. The return of the last hostages to Budyonnovsk brought some solace to the battered town, but it did not dull the anger that many people feel about the behavior of Russia's army and government during the hostage crisis. A doctor released by the Chechens last night expressed his bitterness at the army's attack on the hospital last Saturday.
That day, 3 of our patients went mad as a result of the fighting. I saw it myself.
The government is clearly in disarray over the disaster at Budyonnovsk, which has given the political opposition the opening it has long been seeking. The consequences of Basayev's raid may go far beyond the physical damage and the lost lives.
The car that exploded was parked in the very centre of Grozny, alongside the headquarters of the Russian-backed administration. It exploded at lunchtime, without warning, with devastating effect. A terrorist attack on their own capital. Chechen rebels have promised to carry on their fight for independence from the Russian Federation. Their military commanders warned they'll take action to block elections due here later this month.
While the Russian government insists these elections will go ahead, Chechen separatists are determined to disrupt them. This attack on the administration building in the centre of Grozny shows how far they're prepared to go.
Russian troops are deployed across the Chechen Republic. Attacks on their positions have increased as the elections draw closer. But officials at the Central Electoral Commission told us voting will go ahead. They even predicted a high turnout. Chechnya needs elections now, they said. But in the towns and villages outside Grozny, there is still strong support for the separatists. People here say they'll boycott the elections. They regard the Russians as an army of occupation. If the Russians stay, they can expect further attacks, said one regional commander. Almost a year after Russia invaded Chechnya, any lasting ceasefire appears further away than ever. Lawrence McDonnell, Channel 4 News, Grozny.